Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to our session. My name is Laura Bretta. I am a policy officer in the area of democratic governance at the European Commission in the Directorate General for International Cooperation. And I am thrilled to be a chair for this session, for which I do not have the name in front of me, and I excuse myself for that. I also want to excuse myself for any wrong things that I say, any inadequacies. This is the first time I'm in an academic conference, and any errors I might make, please put them on the back of the gap between practice and research, which I'm sure many of you have been tempted at researching. But also I want to bring forward my contribution to bridging that gap by my participation today and by listening to you. With that being said, I want to say, so we have today, if I understand correctly, we have one presentation in person. Thank you very much, Neymat. We have 3 presentations online. The last presentation, paper 4, by Jessica Piombo, is being replaced by a poster presentation by Mr. Luc Amadi. Okay, and with that, I think we can go to the first presentation, and that is Mr. Nimatullah Bezan. If I'm not saying it correctly, I'm sorry. The politics and policies of aid recipient countries and aid effectiveness. Keywords: Afghanistan, principles of aid effectiveness, regime type, fragility. Mr. Bezan, you have the floor. There's a remote control there for the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. Laura, thank you very much for the introduction. And also, I'm very pleased to see some of the familiar faces here, some colleagues, Joey, Daniel, and Combis. And thanks for the opportunity. Before starting the presentation, just to provide a little bit background, my work has been focused very much on state fragility, development, and state building or political economy. So my previous work has explored the impact of aid in situations of fragility. One of my book, 8 Paradoxes in Afghanistan, looks at the impact or role of aid in the process of state building and development, so which I found that aid had paradoxical impact. And the second work I have been working on, state fragility, also focused some parts of it on the role of international community and development aid, how it could reduce fragility. So what I am doing today is a little bit shifting from more conventional wisdom, especially focusing on the role of aid effectiveness principles, or the 5 principles. So what I do today, I raise some of the issues, I make some observations about the aid effectiveness principles, then I provide 2 evidence, both from Afghanistan under different regimes. I discuss some of the problems of aid effectiveness principles or development cooperation, and at the end, I will make some concluding remarks. So coming first to the objectives of aid. So they were developed to determine the degree of or success or failure of international aid. So the general aim of development or aid is to improve the recipient country's development and well-being of people living in those countries. So I make it very particular here. To be clear, I'm talking about development aid because the aid effectiveness principles are concerned with development aid. But also we need to keep in mind that aid is also driven by donors' national and security interests. So then we need to think of security or military aid as well. Now the question is, have the aid effectiveness principles been effective and accounted for diversity in context? What about this? I think I need some water. Thank you. All right, much better now. So the 5 principles we have: ownership, alignment, harmonization, managing for results, and mutual accountability have 2 problems. Number 1 is the limits. They have limits and the problem of relevance, which is the second problem, and accounting for recipient institutions and diversity among the policies of aid recipient countries, respectively. 2 problems, the limits and the problem of relevance. Coming to countries' politics and policies, as well as whether I stated fragile matter for aid effectiveness. How is that the case? If a regime lacks national and international legitimacy and violates citizens' fundamental rights and international norms aligning aid to the objectives of such a regime may be counterproductive. They may or they will hurt citizens. I come to provide the evidence in the next slides. And the second one is, in situations of fragility, the aid effectiveness principles show limits in accounting for stabilization and humanitarian aid, because these countries suffer from lack of capacity, authority, legitimacy, or security. So in response, they receive substantial stabilization aid or military aid. So to make these arguments, I provide the evidence from Afghanistan since 2001. So I provide 2 evidences. The first one is between 2001 and 2021, and the second one is since 2021. The case of Afghanistan are 2 distinctive periods: Republican Afghanistan and Afghanistan under the Taliban totalitarian regime. In the first case, we see the limits of the aid effectiveness principles. And in the second case, we see the problem of relevance of the aid effectiveness principles. How? So under the Republican Afghanistan, I'm talking between 2001 and 2021, the state and had national and international legitimacy and received substantial development, stabilization, and humanitarian aid. The flow of aid in this period was driven by the strategic interest of the donors, such as the US. And such a relationship was by and large shaped by the policies of Republican Afghanistan and the political order which emerged after 2001, which guaranteed the fundamental rights of people. While aid fostered Afghanistan's economic growth and promoted primary and secondary education and expansion of public health services, the way aid was allocated and administered produced paradoxical institutional and political outcomes. During this period, the aid effectiveness principles of ownership, alignment, harmonization, managing for results, and mutual accountability, however, exhibited limits in the case of Afghanistan. How? These principles focused on development aid and aid management. Other types of aid, such as stabilization and humanitarian aid, which was substantial, was by and large neglected or excluded. In addition to these, less emphasis was put on politics and development outcomes or aid impacts. Amid these limits, the growing insecurity and insurgency led to increasing the cost of development and extortion of projects by various actors through corruption or extortion by the insurgents in Afghanistan. So the first lesson is that the principles of aid effectiveness do not appreciate the realities and situations of fragility where the state lacks capacity, authority, and legitimacy. All right, looking at some of the, processes, in 2007, an evaluation was done. It found that upholding to the principle of ownership was low, alignment was moderate, harmonization was moderate, managing for results was low, but only mutual accountability was high. In terms of the situation, economic situation or fiscal situation of the state, here we can see that the state was highly, or the country was highly dependent on foreign aid. As we can see here, a small portion of national budget was financed through domestic revenue. And a large portion of that was, on average, above 70% of national budget was financed through ODI, or development aid, or security aid. And also, I will discuss in the next slide about the mood of aid delivery or aid delivery channels. So one of the problems that we had in Afghanistan in this period was that the state had limited capacity, or the capacity of the state was weak. Because of that, and corruption and preference of some of the donors, a large portion of foreign aid bypassed the state, created a parallel public sector. So here in this slide, you can see that off-budget aid, largely bypassed the government budget. So on-budget aid commitments were those aid which went through the budget or either used national systems, but the rest bypassed the state. And those were allocated and spent to non-state actors. Just in terms of figures, 81 billion in ODI was received from 2001 to 22. But the problem is, this figure is problematic, but it does not include military and the stabilization aid. And in terms of the figures, here we can, if we just review them. So the figure by the US shows that the Congress appropriated $145 billion for reconstruction and related activities in this period. And another figure shows when it calculates other types of expenditures related to intervention and reconstruction activities in Afghanistan, it goes up to $839 billion. So in the case of Afghanistan, and as is the case in many fragile states, military aid and expenditure were substantial and same can be applied to humanitarian aid. In addition, if we just review the aid allocation, more than 50% of aid was allocated to military or security sector. And this figure from 2002 and 10 did not change in the subsequent years. All right. Now, coming to evidence one, issues. What were then the issues, the problem of aid effectiveness principles? So in this period, not only the aid effectiveness principles were lagging, but they also exhibited limits in 4 areas. Number one, it did not account for military and humanitarian aid. Second, it neglected aid impacts. Third, it did not much appreciate the politics and context. And fourth, it overlooked institutional weakness. Coming to second evidence. Looking the case of Afghanistan under Taliban rule since 2001. Amid the US-NATO forces withdrawal from Afghanistan, the regime collapsed in August 2021. It was tragic. And Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. So what happened after that? The Taliban reestablished a totalitarian theocracy, imposed harsh policies, most of which were enforced under their rule from 1996 to 2001. The Taliban abolished the 2004 Constitution of Afghanistan, restricted women activities, and banned girls' access to school above year 7, and relied on excessive coercion and repression of the population. While the UN and US sanctioned the Taliban as an insurgent group in the past, now similar measures were applied to the whole country. So what happened? Afghanistan foreign reserves of 9 billion were frozen by the US. The flow of aid to Afghanistan, which amounted to about 5 billion annually, ended or terminated. And there were massive capital outflows from the country with devastating impact on the economy. Coming to public services, critical public services were either cut or disrupted. And report shows that more than 90% of people fell under poverty line. So now in Afghanistan, we are experiencing universal poverty. Above 90% of people are living below the poverty line. As a result of the Taliban policies, such as violating the fundamental rights of people and international norms, as well as shift in the major power interests, Afghanistan lost access to development and stabilization aid. The only aid that was available and was immune from the sanctions was or is humanitarian aid. So just to provide some figures about humanitarian aid, on 11 January 22, the UN launched a 5 billion funding appeal for its 2022 Afghanistan humanitarian response plan, the largest single country aid appeal in UN history. The figure increased in the subsequent, let's say weeks. But then coming to the policies and politics of the Taliban, de facto administration, it impacted the relationship that Afghanistan has with the rest of the world or donor community. It resulted in the termination of stabilization and development aid to Afghanistan. The Taliban de facto administration lacks domestic legitimacy, and no state in the world officially recognizes it. So now from this, coming to evidence 2, issues since 2001. So what are the problems with the principles? The principles of aid effectiveness, or the Paris Declaration, which is concerned with development aid, are no longer relevant in the case of Afghanistan. Why is that? So two two arguments. First, the principle do not account for humanitarian aid, because now Afghanistan is receiving humanitarian aid. Second, upholding the principles of aid effectiveness will be counterproductive for two reasons. First, if donors support the Taliban policies and priorities, it will result in the termination of aid, as donors will no longer be able to justify their aid to Afghanistan. In Brussels, how can European countries justify their aid if it goes and support the Taliban regime or its policies? Second, on the other hand, it may further lead to the violation of the fundamental rights of people in Afghanistan. If that will be the case, it will hurt people. So that means, in this case, the aid effectiveness principles are not relevant. Coming to the conclusion, I would like to make a few observations. Number one, the aid effectiveness principles have limits and the problem of relevance in accounting for diversity among the policies of aid recipient countries and the recipient institutions. That's why there should be no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to the aid effectiveness principles. We can't have a unified framework applying to all countries. Third, it's imperative to adapt a different set of principles for and redefining the aim of aid and its effectiveness that can appreciate the recipient's regime types and policies as well as institutions. Therefore, I humbly make the case that we need to shift from grand frameworks, having like one big framework, and principle to a more diverse and flexible principles and approaches that can appreciate context and diversity and making aid and development cooperation more effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think now it's time for questions, right? Are you supposed to get questions from the room? And I've heard that questions from academic conferences can be very tough. I'm tempted between being a very good moderator and asking you not to be tough, and also my curiosity about that. So I'll give you the floor. So I'll give you the floor now for any questions. For me, this was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. To you? No? Yeah, there.
Thank you, Dr. Bijan, for your presentation. I may not meet the expectations, so these are just clarifying questions, nothing that serious. First, I was wondering, you provided a graph with the ODA, but then are there any sector-specific differences in terms of, when we talk about aid dependency, how much actually goes to each sector to see, how much aid is actually targeted and at what areas? And I might have misunderstood the conclusion though, but so you mentioned that aid provided that would then in a way support the Taliban regime. But then what is the alternative? Your perception, because you provide a strong empirical argument and evidence, and yes, this is it. But then on the other side, you also mentioned that about 90% of people are poor, and I guess this is also perceived poverty rate, because I don't know how the other research and surveys are going on, so that would be interesting to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Coming to the second point or second question you mentioned, so I made a case that in case if we uphold to the principles of aid effectiveness, align the aid, donors align aid to the Taliban regime, that will hurt people, and also aid cannot be justified. Then what's the solution, the alternative? I'm making the case that it should be reoriented towards people and market. So the aim should be to work with people, directly with people bypass the government or the regime, so work to non-state actors, international NGOs, civil society, and also focus on building the market. I didn't have much time to expand on that, so that would be an alternative, although that's not a desirable alternative because that further weakens national institutions. But there's no an alternative if the state is repressive and if you have a theocratic or totalitarian regime. Coming to the sectoral allocation of aid, yes, we have that information available. So I put together the information about the total flow of aid to Afghanistan. But in terms of priorities, if we categorize them, top one was security, the second one was infrastructure, and then it goes to other sector. But least aid was going to governance in other sectors.
Hi, I'm Ruth Karlitz from the University of Amsterdam, and I just want to thank you for a provocative and challenging presentation. I think, yeah, I'm on my panel later today. There's a paper I'm looking forward to on by Gulnaz Izbekova, who I haven't met yet, but oh, fancy that. But yeah, so her paper is on the unintended consequences of harmonization. And so I think it's like really interesting to see with you the way I'm reading this, and this is also influenced by just going to a poster presentation about challenging how we think about country ownership. It's kind of, I think this also challenges how we think about country ownership, and when the owner or the sort of, people empowered to take ownership, in this case, it's very extreme. But I think what you challenge us is that there are many other places where aid is propping up the status quo. And is that a status quo that is in conflict with other human rights? I can give an anecdote from when I was doing my dissertation work in Tanzania. It was leading up to the 2015 presidential election, and it was looking to be a very competitive election. And I remember being in a room with folks from USAID, and they basically said the quiet part out loud, yeah, it's great that there's more competition, but do these opposition guys really know how to run government? It was that they were more comfortable working with the party in power, despite, talking all about democracy, but then it's much easier to work with the same people they've been working with. So, not really a question, just a bit of rambling, but thank you for that provocation, and I think it's really neat how it fits with some of the other things coming up.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comment. So I agree with what you said, especially in one of the projects I have been working on state fragility. This is one of the key lessons learned from working in fragile states, is that donors often found it easy to support centralized mechanisms and also work with those who they have already established a network. So they find easy ways to deliver aid rather than accepting the challenges or more difficult paths, which could be more sustainable in the long run. Yeah, I echo with what you said.
Just building on your response, Mr. Vision, in your conclusion, in the last points you raised that there should be diverse approaches based on the realities of the ground, while the donors doesn't like, because it makes more workload, it makes more challenges for them, it makes more problems for them in the ground, even for reporting, and they will not have a kind of very well-formed reports based on what they already built, a bubble that they built for themselves, and in that framework they are working in. So how do you think it will be possible then?
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Joe. It's such a difficult question. We have lots of success stories. So if I highlighted some of the, more problematic aspects of aid or development cooperation coming to, let's say, National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan or many other countries, this bottom-up development approaches rather than having like one grand national program. So that really helped communities coming together, identifying their priorities or problems, and then advocating for funding or to implement those projects. But let's make it clear, aid is not the solution for the future of nations. It's like a painkiller, or like it facilitates the process for a short period of time. So I have been working on 6 countries when I was at Princeton University: South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And the question was why some countries were able to develop and become more stable, but not others. So one of the issues is leadership, institutions, and also how aid is allocated. I found in those cases that aid was supporting the market that paid off, that helped those nations to be better off in long term. South Korea, Taiwan is 2 examples. But it's quite a difficult question. It depends on the relationship of, actors, both international and local actors, and also institutions. And the last thing I would like to conclude with that is, in most cases, we can see like a path dependency when it comes to development or political processes in these nations. So that makes it far more difficult. But we have many success stories. And one of the problems, my new book, which is open access, is called the State Fragility Case Studies and Comparisons. There are 13 lessons for the 21st century. It's a big, big name. But one is that in terms of path dependency across many countries. And so the problem is how to break with those, and also the failure of leaders to build on teachable moments or success stories. One example is Afghanistan. The leaders didn't learn how to overcome the cycle of conflict in Afghanistan. Pakistan is another example. The leader didn't learn how to build on those success moments of economic progress. I stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we will turn to the next paper. And we have online, no? Next paper? No, and the next presenter? Yes. And we have Dr. Ravi Kumar Gupta, who is an assistant professor at the Madan Mohan Malaviya University of Technology, Gorakhpur, India. And Mr. Udit Maheshwari. I give the floor to you, Dr. Ravi Kumar Gupta, for the next presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope I am audible.
Loud and clear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So, very good afternoon to all of you. And I firstly want to thanks for giving me opportunity to present. So, this is the first presentation at this forum from my side. So, let me start my presentation. So, the topic of presentation is an analysis of impact of personalism of political policies on effectiveness. So I, along with Mr. Udit Maheshwari, shall be presenting this paper. So basically, this study investigates the scope of political leaders to get incentive to pursue personal votes and influence the association between economic growth and developmental foreign aid in the case of developing democratic nations. Due to due to influence of personalism, the outcome are also affected. Foreign ad for personal advantage by a politician than investigating ad in public good, which will increase economic growth at the cost of public welfare. So this study uses the panel data collected from secondary sources, which range from the year 1971 to 2011. So the basically the findings indicate that that as an developmental foreign aid rises, economic growth will also rise in democratic country which have a lower presence of personalist organization, while economic growth diminishes in case of in countries having higher level of personalism. So the finding of the paper indicate personalism influence the association between government expenditure and foreign aid. So the rising foreign aid cause a rise in expenditure on public good, but in narrow terms only. And also for the selected good in a country where lower presence of personalism, while vice versa in case of higher personalism nations. So let me start my introduction. This study basically is going to investigate the political hurdles that political rulers see for utilization of developmental aid. Most of the research study focus on the effectiveness of developmental aid at macroeconomic level. This study focus on rules of the electoral system in most developing democracies, which create a wide or incentive to pursue a personal vote. While many scholars have noticed that even a single rule of electoral system can influence the behavior of any political elected democratically. This insight has been recently utilized in the study of budgetary process, corruption, and outcome of applied policies. So, the recent literature suggests that outcome of various rules of electoral system, political adaptation, more personalized and incentive providing approach to engage corruption-related activities and focusing more focused government spending for narrowing constituencies. So the above literature indicates that the determinantal influence of the personalism approach may impair the flow of foreign aid into investment in public good. Uh, so, uh, so this is going to create a problem of effective utilization of developmental aid for economic growth and development of aid in receiving countries. So, this study emphasizes on the rules of electoral system which promote political leaders to pursue personalism because of policies in government government are most of the time influenced by personalism pursued by the. So you can see there are few ads providing authority argue to use democracy as the basis of allocation of developmental aid, even though it is not a certain that democratic nation will utilize the developmental aid in a better and more effective manner than any other autocratic nations. So, in actual practice, the eligibility for granting developmental aid is through indicators of the governance that has been adopted by policymakers. So, the indicator usually include aggregate measures such as rule of law, corruption, stability of political leaders, accountability, and regulatory qualities. So, index of government measures consequently that make the political process more unclear, which forms incentive for political leaders to secure any developmental aid. So, examining these political processes require the formation of a model about an individual behavior under various institutional environments. Also, estimating variable which influence the incentive for individual is also a big concern. So figuring out specific rules for electoral system which influence incentive of political leader to pursue towards the involvement in the corruption and allocation of target-based developmental aid or disbursement of small developing electoral decisive uh, constitute provide a purchase over the mechanism. So, which may be found under the beneath the relationship among effectiveness of developmental aid and governance. So many developmental aid granting institutions are allocating more funds toward those developing nations which have lower corruption activities and follow principle of good governance and present empirical research studies of effectiveness of developmental foreign aid uh, and that basically for the developmental nations. So the situation become more critical when the frequent use of statistical method to analyze panel data is subject to criticism because we cannot rely much more on these statistical methods. So more specifically, when developmental assistance is considered as a particular part of gross domestic product or of a particular assistant recipient country. So this will be endogenous to the growth of GDP through constructions in both depict an inverse relation as GDP rises, developmental aid or GDP diminishes. So panel regression of cross-section study of various countries and various literature relate to relate to it indicate poster due to the problem of multicollinearity and autocorrelation. So, uh, this study basically is going to investigate above issue concerning usage of developmental aid per capita instead of GDP aid. So, it also going to uh, analyze of split sample to ascertain collinearity among developmental aid and its interplay with personalism of political leader is not influencing factor for outcome. And third one is introduction of lagged growth on the right side to alleviate in case of serial correlation. So this current study utilizes information obtained from expanding literature regarding the determinantal influence of rules of electoral system motivated by personal interest to understand comprehensively the role of developmental assistance in the economic growth of developing country. The first part investigates the literature related to political institution following a democratic regime and more specific role of an electoral system that paves the way of political to pursue the personal interest. So this study will examine the intensity of personalism affecting economic growth and add relationship by way of side by side mechanism, targeted expenditure and corruption. The succeeding part examines the method and data utilized. In this part, it is figured out the role of empirical study alleviate the majority of current methodological issues connected with the use of panel regression of cross country to investigate the effectiveness of foreign developmental aid. So study it analyzed the influence of personalism on growth and relationship. Afterward, this paper examined one particular channel by which personalism of political leader can affect the influence of ad on growth and development. So, the organization of the government expenditure. So, the outcome of this research reveals that the developmental has a higher chance of correlation with larger public expenditure through public goods like health and education in those democratic countries having the lower presence of personalism. So the last part concludes that the discussion regarding the contribution of obtained outcome in the understanding of effectiveness of developmental foreign aid. So base, this is basically introduction, and the review of many review of literature are also available few are supporting our argument and few are not. So now I request my co-author Udit Maheswari to present the rest of the things. Um, Udit, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay,
sir.
so should I start?
Yes, sir. Is the slide visible? So I am Udit Maheshwari, research assistant.
We don't hear you. Hello? Message from the room? We can't hear you well.
Yes.
Try again, please. And also put on the presentation, please.
Visible?
No, the connection is unstable. We can't hear you.
Audible?
Very bad. Can you turn off the video, maybe?
Clearly?
No, not enough. And we don't see the presentation.
Yes, yes, look. Is it visible?
No, no, the sound is not good enough.
Udit, I am saying from your part.
What?
No, it doesn't work.
Can
I'm
I
sorry.
hear from your part?
Yeah, Professor
No.
Gupta, maybe
Can
you
I
can do the
start my
presentation?
Sorry, I don't understand. Can I start my presentation?
Now it's working much better, yes. Can you try now? But we won't, we didn't see the presentation at all, and the sound was very bad. I think we have tried already, so I will ask Professor Gupta to continue with the presentation, maybe if you can, if you have it.
Okay.
I think this is what you were proposing, right?
Okay.
Okay. Professor Gupta, you have another 5 minutes. There's
Okay.
been, okay? Another 5 minutes to finalize. Will that work?
Okay. So these are the review of literature. So I am skipping.
Yes, and it's working, but I don't see the presentation. Okay, now it's all good.
Is it visual?
Yes.
Okay. So the status of foreign aid allocated to the developing countries. The finding reveals that the developing foreign aid plays a significant role toward the rising of economic growth of various developing countries. As it has been noticed that those developing countries who have received proper developmental assistance perform well. The foreign developmental assistance help to enhance their growth in economic terms among various developing countries. But if it is managed, if it is the management of developmental aid is not done carefully, then developmental aid will not be able to contribute effectively toward the economic growth. So a major objective of developmental assistance to make aid recipient better in terms of sustainable economic growth, development, better standard of living, and elimination of poverty, and to make these developing countries reduce their dependence on foreign aid in future times. So data from many developing countries also shows that the developmental aid is not supporting on economic growth. So the major aid to developing countries. The majority of developmental countries are not able to adequately distribute the amount of foreign aid to various required places. This is due to weak political and governmental policies, and most of the time the policies of aid utilization are heavily influenced by the political intervention, which are motivated by personal interest of political parties. Only a small amount of foreign aid is diverted toward the needy section of the society, while a major share of political aid is moved toward the politically motivated section of the society. So this is the key finding. So you can see the diagram. The diagram shows the developmental financial assistance as a percentage of gross national income in a few developing countries. Uh, in the year 2015, the countries which have received the higher percentage of foreign aid compared to the percentage of its GNI was Sweden with with about 1.40%, and the country which have got the least amount of aid compared to its GNI is Republic and the Poland. So this is one. So, so in the case of very personalized structure, it is more chance to yield incentive for the political leader to engage an illicit activity and target public expenditure. So the beneficiary country of ad are lower prone to divert ad fund toward those activities which expand the growth. So this statement does not support the notion that the developmental foreign ad will enhance illicit activity, but there will be higher possibility of corruption due to presence of huge incentive through the target public expenditure. So developmental aid does not probably have the lower chance of to rise economic growth. So what question arises whether what is economic growth a byproduct of corruption in the current scenario? As corruption cannot be identified and measured easily, despite this, the only way to detect the corruption are the rules of institution, transparency, and direct observation. In fact, despite the presence of the corruption, target public expenditure toward the constituency, which are narrow and personal. So the foreign developmental aid is less probably directed toward the public expenditure, which increases economic growth. Consequently, the personalism of political leader is responsible for conditioning the association between economic growth and corruption to light on the causal process supporting relationship among effectiveness of developmental aid and personal organization. So this study investigate a practical implication of concerned argument spending of public expenditure. So in the case of personalism, organization basically they, uh, uh, are association between economic growth and developmental foreign aid and creating space for incentive to distract developmental fund and developmental funds for activities related to corruption or spending developmental
Professor
funds
Gupta,
on a particular
sorry,
section of society.
Professor Gupta,
Hello.
could you please move to the
Yes.
conclusions because we are.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much.
So this is the
To the
second diagram. Is
conclusions.
taken in the yes, ma'am. Yes. So this is the conclusion. So vastly available studies indicate the effectiveness of foreign aid has much more scope for influence. Suggest that confirmation of standard knowledge of the economic development of the country. So matter for economic policy incorporating reform of neo-orthodox policies will contribute to the economic growth, but also make the impact of foreign aid much more vibrant. A consensus regarding the effectiveness of foreign aid, which makes the aware literature anarchy. Many researchers raise the concern concerning econometrics, but most significant issue is here. Study will whether the study will be able to reach the true exodus impact of political policy on regression of economic growth across country. A higher level of correlation among political policies and economic growth might suggest many things, and how much concerned the government is regarding the welfare of the people, and the imperfection in certain market are the capability of the government to pursue effectiveness, some more better policy. Eventually, we have put less force into the unraveling way from political policies or economic growth. To the present time, the prominent consequences indicate the presence of positive association among the economic growth and the foreign debt. It is not likely to happen to get this through the technique of econometrics and the use of data which are now come to the our disposal. So this study indicates the effectiveness of foreign aid act as conditional for the domestic political group. However, this study tried to address complex econometric issues through the econometric technique. It is important to know that it is logical to understand our important conditional variable and the level of personalism. It acts as exogenous variable to the economic growth.
Thank you very
In
much.
case of
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. We have reached the
thank you, ma'am.
time limit. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Because we lack time, we will go forward with the next presentation, and we will keep the questions for the end of these presentations. Thank you very much, Professor Gupta. And now we go to Melissa David Samarin, Aid and Democratic Outcomes Findings from a Systematic Review. Melissa, we see you now.
Everyone. I'm sorry?
We see you now, but we don't see the presentation yet.
Okay, let me put it in full screen. You still don't see the presentation?
No, I'm asking the technical team. Yes, now we see you and the presentation.
Okay, that's good. Let
Great.
me put it in full screen. Sorry, one moment. Where's my full screen?
Go back to where you were. No,
Yeah.
First time. And then you had full screen there.
I don't see it. Oh no. Huh. Oh, okay. Full screen mode. All right, well, just give my computer one moment and then we'll get started. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting. I'm delighted to present today on behalf of myself and my two co-authors on a project that we've been working on for a couple of years now. This is really a research agenda at this point. There's a couple of projects that we've already had some extensions and some parallel projects emerge from this research, but I'll be presenting our core findings today from this original research, and I'm looking forward to hearing feedback from all of you with regards to questions or things that resonate with you as researchers and practitioners in this field. So our research question asks a really straightforward question, which is, what is the impact of foreign aid on democracy? It's a very straightforward question. It's obviously very complicated and maybe a bit ambitious, but I think it's important to grapple with for several reasons. From a very practical standpoint, it's important to understand how aid is if aid is effective and how it is affecting recipient countries, particularly in the context where we know that aid is identified as a tool that can develop democracy and improve governance. So it's understanding whether or not that's actually happening within a country is, I think, a critical question to ask. However, if you turn to the literature is quite unruly. It's rather overwhelming. There's really been a lot written on this particular topic, and yet there's not necessarily a singular conclusion or consensus about the role of aid in democracy that emerges upon first glance. So we wanted to bring a little bit more methodological grip to this research or to this literature, be able to speak about it in a bit more nuanced way and hopefully a more productive way. And of course, in identifying the trends and the major overarching trends in the literature, we also hoped to kind of open up the areas of gaps in our knowledge and areas that could be better served by further research. We also had theoretical motivations for pursuing this. I think this is one of the more interesting contributions of our paper, and I'm happy to speak more about this, but one of the things that we wanted to do was to bring together the literature on aid effectiveness and democratization. These are two very important and big literatures. They are in many ways related to one another, but they very rarely speak directly to each other. So we wanted to bring them together as a way to understand a bit more about the channels and the mechanisms through which aid operates and how it fits within the democratization phenomenon or process. Democratization is obviously very complex and complicated, so I don't mean to be reductionist about it, but what we did is we approached democratization by understanding it within three major camps or models of democratization. Those that emphasize structural forces or pre-existing conditions in a country, those that emphasize institutions, especially democratic institutions, and those that highlight the role of agent-based or individual action on democracy. So we develop an analytical approach to our research, first by drawing on the conception of aid as either developmental or political, as laid out by Carruthers in a paper in the Journal of Democracy, and we overlay this on these three theories of democratization or camps of democratization I've just mentioned. And what we find is this quite nice roadmap on the way to liberal democracy. And in our approach, we find that developmental aid maps on quite nicely with structuralist theories of democratization, whereas political aid, what we call democratic aid, maps on quite nicely to theories of institutional and agent-based theories of democratization. I think to have full liberal democracy, you need all of these components at work, but at least what we found with this approach is that it maps out quite nicely the channels and the mechanisms through which we think aid might be at work within a country. So how we go about answering this question is we apply a systematic review. I won't go into a whole bunch of details about the particulars of this methodology, but I'm happy to answer that in Q&A. But for those of us who aren't familiar, a systematic review is a particular way to scan a corpus of literature and systematically identify publications from which you can include into a review that you can draw assessments and conclusions about a particular research topic. So we applied the standard PRISMA and CoTrain methods in our systematic review and included papers that specifically utilize quantitative methodologies and for whom the independent variable was foreign aid or foreign assistance of some sort, and the outcome variable, the dependent variable, was a democracy measure, which I will mention a little bit more about in a moment. From this, we combined all these papers into a rather extensive matrix, and we collected a lot of different data variables from these publications. These are just some of the important variables we collected, but there were many, many more. A lot of variables about the metadata of these publications, the type of methodologies they used, the outcomes that they measured, and of course, the directionality of the effect, whether or not aid was seen as positively or negatively impacting democracy building. just a quick note on operationalization before I launch into our findings. We do primarily differentiate between developmental and democracy aid, as I've mentioned. This comes from this conceptualization from Carruthers that I just talked about, but we also draw on the CRS purpose codes for this, and also in how papers themselves talked about aid. So a lot of papers were very good about specifying whether or not it was developmental or democracy aid. And so we categorized these papers based on how the publications themselves identified the type of aid they were analyzing. I'd also like to make a note about how democracy was measured. I will say that we, as the researchers on this, remained quite agnostic as to how papers measured democracy. One of the things that we were really careful about in our systematic review was making sure that the dependent variable was specifically noted to be democracy. That was part of our inclusion criteria. So as long as a paper justified its outcome variable as a proxy or a measurement of democracy, and it met the rest of our criteria, we included it in the review. So these are some of the more popular outcome variables that were utilized across the studies. There were definitely others, and they were quite varied. But I will say that all dependent variables, all measures of democracy, were some sort of measure of regime type or institutions or quality of governance. So I'll turn to our results. What did we actually find? Well, first of all, we identified 90 publications, unique publications in this systematic review. And from these 90 papers, there were some really key and apparent trends that emerged. So the first thing, we noticed that most papers overwhelmingly addressed global aid distributions. There were some regional papers that looked at Africa, former Soviet Union countries, Latin America, and MENA countries, but the overwhelming majority did look at global aid flows. As I kind of hinted at, most papers were very specific as to what type of aid they were referencing, whether it was democracy aid or developmental aid. There are some exceptions to this, but overall there was a high degree of identification about the type of aid. But I think what was chronically underspecified across these publications was the type of aid modality. So whether this was technical assistance, a core contribution, project intervention, or budget support. So the aid modality was very, very rarely specified. In fact, a minority of papers did so. And I think that's important to call out, especially because we know that aid modalities are really critical to understanding aid flows themselves. Endogeneity was also a persistent concern across papers, and fortunately, I think a majority of them at least made mention of endogeneity and this problem of the endogeneity of aid. Most of those papers did apply some sort of quantitative methodology in order to overcome this, but nearly a third, almost fully a third of papers made no mention of endogeneity, and so I think that's also something important to keep in mind when understanding and reviewing some of these results. And finally, and the last thing I'd like to just make note of, which I think was an important trend across these studies, was the importance of domestic political conditions. So many papers made note that these domestic political conditions within a recipient state were often, intermediaries to the impact of aid on the ground. So a lot of them made note that already democratizing conditions or contexts were more likely to see more democratic building. A lot of them also made note that, especially if the aid was being given to institutions, that having a higher quality of institution was also helpful for generating more, for stronger outcomes of democracy building. When we look at the directionality of this effect, I'm pleased to announce that there does seem to be an overall positive trend that in general, aid does appear to be positively impact democratization and democracy building. And this is particularly true for democracy aid, so which seems to have a much stronger effect than just developmental aid. Of course, developmental aid also we see trending positive. However, there were, in many cases, it seemed like it took longer for developmental aid to manifest results, and also there were often many conditions applied to this positive impact within the developmental aid analysis. I will also say that many of these studies looked at both developmental and democracy aid, and also many of them found both positive and negative impacts on democracy, depending on some of these conditions. So we do have some inflated numbers here, but in general, we do see this kind of positive trend towards aid positively impacting democracy. This is also the case for several other factors, including multilateral donors, which seem to be particularly effective at producing positive democratizing impacts, as well as with technical assistance and project interventions. I've just mentioned that aid modalities tend to be chronically underspecified, so we are working with a smaller N of studies here, but I think given even this even this limited evidence that we have, there does seem to be a really positive and potentially promising research agenda here for further inquiry, particularly in the realm of technical assistance. So I'll conclude here with just some main takeaways and a couple of notes about this research agenda. As I've mentioned, we've already dived into several other projects and are starting to think about expanding this research further. So this is just a few of the areas that we've been thinking about, but it's not an exhaustive list. But I think the main takeaways that I'd just like to leave with all of you today is that targeted democracy aid particularly seems to be effective at inducing democratizing outcomes within recipient states. Developmental aid is as well, but again, it's this targeted and specified democracy aid that does appear to be the most effective. This is maybe to some extent not surprising, at least it's good to know that in general it seems that this aid is producing intended outcomes, but I think it's also important because it is consistent with the idea of institutional or agent-based theories of democratization. So we conclude that it is most likely that aid is working through these particular channels in order to produce democratizing outcomes. I'd also like to just reiterate the importance of considering aid modalities, donor characteristics, and domestic political conditions when thinking about aid flows or potentially considering issuing aid flows, and just how important those characteristics are in mediating those outcomes. Again, we just wanted to provide a general kind of brushstroke overview of this literature, provide some greater detail to the literature. And I think that, in general, there does seem to be this positive trend again. However, I think there's also room for much improvement and further research to be done. So with that, I will conclude. If there are questions, I also have more details about the methodology, but I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much. For the questions, we are going to take them after the last presentation, if there's time, because we have very little time left. So now, thank you very much for... Okay, let me take back what I just said, because I've heard that the last presenter is not online with us, so we can go to questions. So Melissa, please stay online with us. So if there are questions, I don't know if there are questions from online. I'm looking at the technical team. Any questions from online? No questions from online. So we're looking at the room here to ask if there are any questions. And I'm asking for the hostess to give the microphone here in front. Yes.
Is it already on? Yeah.
Yeah, please mention to whom the question it will be, okay?
Yeah, it's a question to Melissa. Thank you very much for your presentation. Hello, my name is Leah. I'm from a German Evaluation Institute. And I was wondering, thanks for this valuable study. I mean, I really would like to read the paper, actually. So first of all, is it already published? And second, Can you say something about the size of this positive effect? So can we say something about how effective is actually democracy aid or also developmental aid? And my second question is with regards to the context in partner countries. So you were mentioning that there were a few studies actually talking about the mediating effect of the partner country context. And I was wondering whether you actually looked at interaction terms. So whether, for example, in certain contexts, aid can also have a negative effect on democracy, because we have all these case studies actually projecting quite negative results, and this is a bit in contrast with the findings from the systematic review. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. So the first one is our paper is currently in review, so it should be published hopefully soon. So I'll keep you posted on that. I guess it's, trying to figure out the best way to answer this. I do have appendix slides if there, if there's specific studies. I think in general, yes, there were. Several papers that we found that had negative impact on democracy. There were a sizable amount, particularly in developmental aid. It's hard to say what the effect is. I think that where we saw the strongest effect was on institutions, because there were so many different dependent variables that were used across these publications. Some of these dependent variables were just Freedom House and polity scores. Some of them were specific electoral outcomes or quality of institution. I would say across the studies, looking specifically at these different dependent variables, I think the quality of institutions does seem to be where there's the greatest impact. It can have the most sizable impact, but that is again something that I think needs to be clarified further in the literature. I think so many times we see across these studies that sometimes equating these different dependent variables got really, really messy. So I agree with you. I think there does need to be more, careful consideration of this, but that's what we generally found. I think I answered both of your questions. Remind me if I forgot, but yeah, so I think what we found was that in terms of the size of it as well, we also found in some cases, what I was presenting here were statistically significant results. So at least there was, a statistically significant positive outcome, but there were also a lot of these, quantitative outcomes that showed a positive trend, even if it wasn't statistically significant. So I think, considering that in mind as well, I think the trend itself was largely positive. But I'm happy to speak more one-on-one about all of those negative findings, because there were quite a few, and I think there's some problems with those publications. So I'm happy to discuss with you in person afterwards if there's further interest.
Thank you very much, Melissa. There are two other questions coming from two other researchers here. Thank you.
Right. So this is for Melissa as well. So I think you have been mentioning a lot about a range of.
Can you please say your name?
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Kang. I'm from King's College London. So it's you've been talking about a range of econometric methods and how you select your publications, and then you've just mentioned that the few publications that gave us negative results are problematic. I think that's what you should mention. So my question is, can you give us a bit of details on the methodological approach of those, positive results, those no insignificant result, and the negative result? Because what I'm thinking is that maybe the true effect is no, and the one with problematic would give us, either positive or negative. So your conclusion is about having a overall positive trend. Mm-hmm. Is it guaranteed? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile question. Actually, in I didn't really present it too much here. I talked about endogeneity, and one of the ways that we looked kind of as we were mulling over these results, we were thinking a lot about the quality of these papers, because you're right, just running a straight OLS is not the same as potentially having, instrumental variable analysis and two-stage least squares analysis, right? There's different levels of this quality. And so what we ended up looking at is sort of categorizing these papers in terms of quality, of whether or not these papers looked specifically at endogeneity and whether or not they used some sort of instrumental variable analysis, or at least a robustness check. When we do that, and I didn't actually put that in my slides because I didn't know if I would have enough time to go into it, but when we actually do that, I think it's both revealing and potentially limiting to our research, because many of those papers that don't include some sort of endogeneity check actually are papers that look specifically at democracy aid. So those are the majority of the papers. And as I've sort of mentioned, right, it does seem that democracy aid has this positive trend, but it could also be because the methods are slightly shoddy or less developed, I should say. So I think that is a concern. However, I would also say, there's problems with this as well, because the instruments were often, it's really hard to get a good instrument for aid. There are some standard instruments that were set about by Goldsmith and others that people tend to recycle over and over again. And I guess, that's fair, but there's always questions about whether or not instrumentation is appropriate for these types of studies. So we did see a lot of instrumental variable analysis. There was a lot of GMM instrumentation. And I think that, to me, suggests those are more quality studies, simply because there is this, they typically ran an OLS or a probit model on top of these additional kind of instrumental checks. But again, so, in that way, it is helpful, because we do see most of those papers have these positive outcomes, but the ones that don't tend to be those that look at democracy aid. So there's kind of a trying to grapple with how to present this in our findings. But I to your point, I think it is, we do need some sort of like quality check about these papers.
Thank you, Melissa. There was a question here on the left, and I'm looking at Andrea for how long can we can still go on. Good. One more question. Okay.
Yeah, hi, Melissa. Daniel Esser here from American University and IDOS in Germany. I have a very related question to Kang's, I think. I think if I caught this correctly, you said that of the 90 studies, 29 had did not account for endogeneity.
Yep.
And so when you said, you believe that in your paper you may kind of need to up the rigor a little bit. Maybe, but I would say most importantly, I think you probably want to up the transparency, because my experience with policy advisory is that the most powerful people who are going to read your paper will have absolutely no understanding of the methods you're using. They're just going to run with the basic message. And that strikes me, I do think, what does the world need when it comes to democracy aid? It needs the kind of systematic review that you're doing. So thank you for doing it. But please also keep in mind that the technical sophistication of most bureaucrats who work in international aid is at the level of a toddler. So I mean it. So I was wondering, one way to represent your findings could be to parse out, of those studies that did actually account for endogeneity, what does it look like? And then, so if you have subsamples, basically, where you group by level of rigor according to whatever you find methodologically warranted, I think that would be fantastic, because otherwise I fear that this could be the kind of greed or grievance cesspool that we've been in 20 years ago, and that took us about 10 or 15 years to get out of.
Thank you. That's actually an excellent suggestion, and potentially, so we are hopefully going to also speak to a scholarly audience as well. But you're right. This is a dual paper. We do hope that practitioners look at this as well. So I like that idea of drawing subsets, and that is, we sort of hinted at that in a future iteration, but I think we could be much more specific about making that distinction. So thank you for the recommendation.
Thank you very much. That was the last question, but let me maybe just give a suggestion. I would like to see that the methodology you used and the data you used to have this research on the level of complexity that bureaucrats have on democracy. Thank you very much. Here from the first rank. for the last question.
Thank you. My question is from Malaysia. In terms of the study of the aid impact, a number of studies concluded that aid is prolonging regime stability rather than democracy. That's one thing. And the second one, coming to the aid democratization impact, how about the types of, accountability we see in those countries? Because one of my study found that aid can have paradoxical democratic impact, especially when we are looking at democratic accountability. What happens? It shifts accountability upward from citizens to donors. If you can comment on that. Thank you.
I didn't hear your first comment. I'm sorry, there was some noise with the microphone. So I didn't catch your first comment, if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned that some of the studies found that foreign aid prolongs regime stability, not democracy.
Oh, with regime stability. Oh, I see. So there were a couple papers that looked specifically at regime stability. This isn't something that we looked too much into detail within our review, and that's certainly something that maybe we want to consider because, we weren't thinking along these lines when we first set out to do this review. But there definitely were papers that looked at stability, specifically in the context of like post-war or post-conflict situations. I'm thinking about maybe like 5 or 6. So we could certainly look at that a little bit more. We haven't actually given much methodological rigor to that concern yet. In terms of the accountability of aid, this was actually something that, again, our systematic review wasn't focused on aid fungibility. I did talk about the mechanisms that we were looking at, specifically mechanisms of democratization, but certainly in papers, and I should say this is to a point to the earlier question about quality and how to sort of rank these papers in terms of how their methodological quality and outcomes. One of the other things that we did look at was whether or not papers themselves talked about mechanisms or kind of channels of aid, and some of them did. So very similar to endogeneity, there was about a third that did mention kind of channels or mechanisms of aid, and a lot of them did mention fungibility and kind of accountability of aid. That fungible aid, most of them assessed that fungible aid is less effective than non-fungible aid. That's sort of targeted. Again, it's consistent with our findings that targeted aid does appear to be most effective. So that was a finding that I think we can definitely subset and speak more carefully to in our paper. We can, I'm happy to amend that because I think it is an important finding. But ultimately, we wanted to speak more to the democratization literature, a little bit to the kind of theoretical scholarly side of it. But I think that a lot of papers did find, non-fungible aid that was accountable to whatever particular outcome it was intended for also did tend to be more effective. So I think that's something that we can highlight as well.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you. May I say something before you close the session? So an announcement, our fourth presenter, Luca Madi, couldn't be connected, had some connection problems. He's a poster presenter. He was supposed to travel here, but unfortunately due to some travel issues, he wasn't able to join us. And he had these connection problems. But you are able, we invite you to take a look at his poster, which arrived and reached this place in the coffee room, and his poster is entitled "Can Development Cooperation Be Effective at the Decline of Multilateralism? Evidence from Empirical Review and Implications for Inclusive Partnerships."
Thank you, Andrea. And thank you all for participating and asking very good questions. And thank you for the presentations, especially the last one was great. I'm going to bring back the research to my bosses. They're going to be very happy. And I have looked for endogeneity on Google during your presentation, so that really helps. Thank you very much. Have a good day.